Alright, firstly, I updated the A* method to favor the goal cell over all other cells. I know this seems kind of obvious, but it was easy to see how the code would get confused if the goal was, say, on fire. Now, if the goal is adjacent to you, no matter what, move into it. Next, I did a bat again, working for the future, and I made the movement code a little bit more generic so that enemy AI can use the same framework. After that, I wanted to work on the spell system, but I ended up sitting on my keyboard brainstorming for an hour. Eventually, I decided to write up my goals for the system and see where that took me. I knew that there were some things that I had already decided for the game theme-wise. For example, I knew that I wanted the world and spells to be very similar to generic fantasy like D&D, since my concept was originally wizards getting fed up being the punchline of every other class's joke. To translate that theme easier, the world would be very predictable and easy to understand by the player. Elves are tall and dexterous, and dwarves have beards and drink. You don't have to do any extra thinking there. Right off the bat, that solved my UI problem. See, I was trying hard to figure out what kind of spell selection system I wanted to use, and there was a lot of options. Pokemon has its 4-move system, JRPGs have ability selection trees, and some games use hotkeys with pretty graphics, but I was mimicking D&D. And in D&D, if your brain simply can't comprehend the amount of stuff you have to write down for spells, you use cards. These cards contain all the information you need to cast a spell, and you build or prepare your hand differently every time you rest, so in any given battle, you're only looking through a dozen cards at the most, instead of a whole deck. That UI seems really easy to understand, and so it's perfect for my game. Each wizard has a hand of abilities which refreshes when they rest, and in any given round of combat, they can choose a card from their hand and discard it to cast it. I also wanted to have spells that weren't discarded when cast, like cantrips and RPGs, which would ensure that even if you ran out of one-offs, you could still participate in the fight. And maybe also spells which were discarded but didn't end your turn to cast, so you could buff yourself and cast a spell in the same turn, at the expense of 2 cards from your hand. These could be really easily readable by simply color-coding the cards. Green cards are reusable, blue cards are free, and red or yellow cards are normal. What's cool is that this system doesn't just have to work for spells. Any ability can fit in and work just as well. As an example, let's imagine a wolf enemy. It could have a green bite ability that it would never run out of, a blue howl ability that buffs his friends and doesn't end his turn, and a red rake ability that would act as a one-off AoE. This would help manage the enemy AI or even let the player see the hand of each enemy unit. Plus, even though the base party would always be composed of wizards, some spells like Summon Elemental, Raise Dead, or Dominate Beast would allow you to pull other units into combat, which use the same card system for their admittedly non-spell abilities. I'm actually really happy with this idea, and I'm really hoping that I'll be able to translate it into Unity well. I added cards into the game which just reuse the floating window graphic for now and set them up to be selectable with the mouse. I then thought for a while on how the spell system would actually work in the code. I needed to make sure that new spells were easy to code and effortless to add into the system, since I'll likely be working with a lot of them. I ended up working with a mix of scriptable objects and inheritance, allowing me to easily create spells or even variants and cast them from any entity script. I actually had some trouble finding a good source online to help solve this problem, so I'm going to go into some depth here about the strategy that I used. If you don't really care about the specifics of the coding, go ahead and skip to this timestamp. Okay, so the problem is with the way that Unity references things. Let's imagine I wanted an array of all of the spells that Wizard A knows. Well, that array would have to be composed of data that all share the same type. You can't populate an array with 1 integer, 3 booleans, and a string. That means that all spells would have to belong to the same type, which in this case means all residing in the same class. This would work if I had a spell index system, which could be called from the player script and given the index of which spell to cast, but I would have to have an if-else or state system for that to work, and it would have to be added to every time I coded a new spell, so no. Luckily, there is a workaround here through inheritance. I always hear inheritance described using the hierarchy of life, but it works, so I'll use it here too. Imagine a class of things called animals, and all animals have a couple of things in common like names and the ability to move. But some animals differ from others in important ways, so you want to break the system apart a little more, into mammals and birds, for example. While they all share the qualities of animal, they all also have some of their own qualities. The mammal might have a variable for fur color. The important part here is that they can override some functions of their parent class while still being referenceable as an animal. The bird might have an override to the move function in the animal class to be more consistent with the flight of birds. Now, whenever the bird is asked to play the move function, it overrides to the bird's unique flight system. The trick is that I can use this system for spells too. All spells have some unifying variables and a function called cast for when the spell is called, but each individual spell has some unique variables, and most importantly an override to the cast function. Using this system, I can create an array or list of the spell class, and any spell I write can be added because it's a child of the required class. Then I can take any spell from the list and call the cast function of the spell, and it will override to the unique effects of that spell. I know that this explanation was more theory than hard syntax, so I'll link some videos in the description so you can learn from more qualified people. With that done, I just needed to have a way for the player to target a cell and for the spell to cast to that location. I started off by giving every spell a target type, since not all spells target in the same way. Some spells might only target the caster, and others may simply target enemies, and others the environment itself. I then updated the camera script to reflect these changes, and allowed the cell to be selected and fed back into the spell system. Giving the green wizard a list of a couple debug spells, I was able to pull up his so far untextured hand of cards, select one of them, and cast it. Lastly, I needed to update some of my pre-made but unused content to fit better with the predictability of the game. I wanted players to know exactly what their spells would do every time. No chance to miss, no variable damage. This is important because if you've ever played a game with consumable items like potions or special ammo, I bet you find yourself saving it for a better moment, which never really comes. I never wanted the player to feel like they wasted their spell or were cheated out of its intended effect. This is also the reason I got rid of the action point system, as otherwise the player would have no idea how many actions their enemy had or no good way to predict them. Keeping with the theme of D&D without blatantly copying, I gave each entity 6 stats: health, speed, and resistance as your physical stats, and focus, purity, and grit as the mental stats. These mental stats will be referenced in spells to make them more powerful, and since you can't be good at all 3 of them, it'll force you to focus your wizards down certain lines and determine which spells to give to each wizard. Okay, so that was a long one. In the next week, I want to make some debug enemy units and start coding some actual spell effects. A sub-series of videos here might be voiceless showcases of spells that I've made. We'll see. Thanks for watching.